Yeah. Yep. We're about to start.
We're live. And welcome back to this week's episode of 11 Named People. As we always remind our audience, the title comes from something the great British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm once wrote, that the imagined community of millions is made most real in the form of 11 named people on a football field. So the connections between football and society and politics, and today we are thrilled. We are taking it to the next level today because we are really excited to present our guest. We are very, very honored to have Ronnie Kasrils, legendary South African revolutionary, former Minister of Intelligence after the victory was won, but before that, a guerrilla commander in the ANC's Umkhonto we Sizwe, a Central Committee member of the South African Communist Party, and a lifelong revolutionary with perfect credentials, some of you might think, for an Arsenal fan, a gooder. So, Ronnie, we the stories, the bits, the anecdotes that we've heard over the years. I mean, the thing that most fascinates me, and for us to set the scene for our audience, you're in the Umkhonto training camp somewhere in Africa. It's Saturday afternoon. BBC World Service, Paddy Feeney, BBC World of Sport. You're listening to this in the context of a national liberation struggle, guerrilla training camp. Tell us describe that. What was that all about? What was that feeling? Why Arsenal? How was that playing in the Umkhonto camps? And yeah, please tell us the stories.
Okay, better come back to Arsenal a bit later, and we'll get deep into the Angolan jungles at our training camp at a place called Kibashi, which is deep in the forests. And of course, we needed to have leisure time. And this was generally on a Saturday afternoon. I had a small transistor radio, and I always used to tune in to English football. I'll tell you, there are two anecdotes, plus I played football there as well for Mandela United, and I played, the last goal I've scored in my life was in Angola, in Luanda, playing for Umkhonto we Sizwe team against an Angolan team which had a lovely Cuban guy playing there, and I actually scored a goal. And I was about 44 years old, by the way. Most of those guys were spring chickens in their early 20s or so. But back to the Angolan camp at Kibashi, we actually had a makeshift football pitch there on the parade ground where we tended to play games as well. So on the one occasion, I've got malaria really badly, and I'm lying on my bunk bed in a small room, and I'm listening to Arsenal are 1-1 against Newcastle United, and it's going into extra time, and I'm listening through this malarial fever. And into extra time, my hero from Arsenal was a big, burly centre forward called Ray Kennedy.
Oh,
and little Georgie Armstrong, the smallest guy on the field, puts a corner across, and brilliant BBC commentary. Ray Kennedy jumps higher than anybody and nets it. And as I cheer, a gecko, a little lizard, loses its footing off the ceiling and smacks me in the face. That kind of surreal situation I'll never forget. But the other one, maybe I frightened with my Arsenal-type hooligan cheering, the little gecko, which is why it fell. But the other occasion is that Joe Slovo, legendary South African revolutionary Marxist leader, as South Africans and many people globally know, he was visiting the camp, and we've been very busy, hard at work, and it was again a Saturday afternoon, taking a bit of a break, and we're listening to a game. It wasn't Arsenal versus Chelsea, which we always used to bet on because he was a Chelsea fan, but we're listening, and the results then come through in that doleful BBC way, like, Arsenal 2, Coventry 1, and you'd go through, and my team won and Chelsea lost, and he was deep in depression. And he says to me, it's crazy, this. Here we are, all these miles from English football, here in Angola. We're busy making the South African Revolution. We've been listening to the results, and I'm so disappointed. I'm depressed, Slovo says. He says, how do you explain it? So I said, well, that's the $64,000 question. How football gets into your skull, into your psyche, and become depressed. As we know, every football supporter, Sean, gets utterly depressed. I do to this day. I'm a South African. I'm here in Joburg, but I watch Arsenal playing as much as possible. And Arsenal, of course, these last years have been absolutely pathetic, even in the last of the Wenger years. At last, we've got something to cheer about. It's looking good. But I get utterly depressed. Obviously, Slovo wasn't depressed much further than maybe the next hour or so, but we were very busy and we get into other things. But I remember saying to him, Joe, please don't get philosophical about football, for goodness sake. And I always have thought of a quote from Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean poet, as we well know, revolutionary poet. He used to say that don't philosophize about poetry and love. I add to that, and I said this to Joe, please, let's not philosophize about football. It'll drive me nuts because you get dragged into it, and every football fan in the world can spend hours and waste so much time on the philosophical level. What makes a team good or bad? What are these players playing for? So many questions along those lines. But we used to have great fun. And the other thing, if I might say, talking about Joe Slovo, and as you know, Tony, we were in exile for many years and in England, in London, and you invariably got involved with the English football game. He happened to support Chelsea.
Why?
And I happened to support Arsenal. I had a better, more political reason than him. The only reason that Joe Slovo supported Chelsea was that his somewhat well-off South African fellow exile, Sylvester Steyn, who wrote Second Class Taxi, was a poker-playing mate of Joe's. And Sylvester Steyn was a rich guy, as I've said. He had 2 season tickets. And if Joe was nice to him, he would get taken to Chelsea. So he supported Chelsea for that reason. I supported Arsenal because you could go to Arsenal and shout out, come on, you Reds, come on, you Reds. It also was such a community-based club, and I didn't live that far away, North London. It was basically very Irish when I started in the 60s. And it quite soon, round about like the mid-70s or so, started featuring black players, local kids. And there was a guy called Brendan Batson.
Yeah, Brendan Batson.
He was a great football player. He was the first black player in the top Premier in those days, First Division teams. And then they had one of the most glorious black footballers called David Rocastle a little later, who was majestic. And I think he would have become something like Pele. He was so graceful and artistic. And unfortunately, he got cancer very young and died. Just let me digress and talk about Issa Pahad, who supported Leeds. Why does he support Leeds? Because Leeds was the first English football team, first and second division, who in the late 50s signed on a black South African, Albert Johansson. And so clearly the identity factors played a big role in the choices, certainly of us exiles. Otherwise, you live in a neighborhood, and this was the charm of football past and what we miss today, when it was totally community-based, and it was the players were really from the community. So a team like Arsenal, Queen's Park Rangers, Nottingham Forest, Chelsea very late in the game, it involved black players. That's why I loathe Chelsea. So there was this aspect to it. And there were also, at that time, I was recruiting couriers to come into South Africa to carry in false documents, money, communication for underground people. And later they became very involved in actually assisting in the distribution of leaflets and such like. And there were quite a few London working class guys, trade unionists, who supported, of course, West Ham United and Millwall and these very working class clubs. But also there was quite a group supporting Arsenal. So I linked up in that manner. So much more political than Joe Slovo. For him, it was purely a commercial reason joining, supporting Chelsea.
Tony, I think Tony froze.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I think he might be back in a minute.
Maybe he's looking deep in thought, puzzling out what I said about Joe Slovo.
I think he was gonna. I think the question I suppose he was gonna ask you was about this kind of Joe Slovo supporting Chelsea. I think he's back. Is he back? Tony, I think you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, sorry.
About I don't want to steal it. You want to go ahead? Yeah.
Sorry, can I also...
Sorry.
Just to prompt you...
I mean, I have many questions.
Sorry, I'm not... I think you were cut out, but I did want to talk about how I constantly beat Joe Slovo in football bets.
Oh, go ahead. Tell that story. Yeah. Okay,
so there we are working
closely,
secret work, clandestine work, and so on. And of course... as I've already mentioned, the football, it's more than a pastime in some ways, but it's leisure, it's relaxing, and you get deeply involved. So he was so strong in his support for Chelsea, as I was for Arsenal. We ended up having an annual bet. It was a simple bet, and it only featured Arsenal and Chelsea. Which of those teams would finish up higher in the league, Arsenal or Chelsea? If it was Arsenal, I won the bet. Chelsea, he won the bet. And the bet was also quite modest. We worked near one of the first Greek Cypriot cafes that were selling kebabs and pita bread and basic stuff like that. And it was really... The bet was about a lunch. Who would pay for that lunch? And I can tell you that for the entire period, we were in London together. So that's from 65 to well into 77. He's off to Africa and I follow. In that 12-year period, I won every single game. He was only let off once. I can't remember the year, but it's when Chelsea were relegated to the second division. So we couldn't, he was let off. Otherwise, I won every single year.
It's too bad. There was a period when they were winning, which is, I think, sadly, by then he had passed away, right? When they started
well, and you could ask, what would the comrade who wrote "Has Socialism Failed?" made of Chelsea's ownership circa 2000?
Yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. I mean, that's what spoiled football. We've mentioned this commodification, the commercialization. I mean, Newcastle now in the hands of the Petro Saudi empire and other teams as well. You know, we go to Arsenal, it used to be Highbury, and now it's the Emirates, all that kind of money. So what saves football from these moguls is the fans. And of course, the fans are maybe not based totally within the ground, that community, because they spread out and they also in other towns and abroad more. But there still is, whether it's Chelsea or Fulham or West Ham, Liverpool, great, wonderful community. Absolutely brilliant. But you get the community there. And what I love is the rebellion at Manchester United against the Glazer brothers. So the community still counts. But, you know, the players, as much as we worship them, if the team loses, the players look really browbeaten and depressed. But I can tell you, and I've known some of them, the moment that game is over and they back home, they forget about it. They ain't depressed. The fans are depressed until the next game comes up. There's a big difference. Although some of the players and some coaches are a bit better than that and tend to develop something of a loyalty. But nothing like
to talk about power and class for a minute. It's interesting that you're talking about, you know, the centrality of the fans, because actually we've actually discussed this a lot in the class that we teach, that the spectacle that has made English football the global power center. I mean, I saw the spending figures for this current transfer window. It's insane. It's like the Premier League spent more on transfers this past window than the next three leagues combined. It's like the Premier League is to football what the United States is to global military spending. It dwarfs everybody else by a factor of like 20. So, but what's created this is the TV spectacle, right? That you can sell in China, you can sell in India, you can sell in South Africa, you sell all over the world for billions of dollars. But the chemistry that actually creates that spectacle is the fans. It's like football in an empty stadium is not a TV spectacle. And as Cantona, as you rightly, the philosopher of the game, said, England is magic. It's like there's no place like England for the chemistry of the fans and the game. So this is a long question, but when it comes to things like shenanigans, like the all of these oligarchs want to create a super league and take away promotion relegation, which is the key to the game. The fans rebel and they have to back off, right? And I'm also thinking about, I see there's a Palestine poster behind you on the wall, and it's a question we've discussed many times. Like, BDS, and it was so important in the South African context, the sports boycott. And you can see how on the Israeli side, they've kind of sewn things up in FIFA. Like FIFA, and in the bureaucracy of FIFA, nothing is happening. But the fans have power. The football civil society has some sort of power. What do what's your thoughts about the power of fans in the game in England, globally, and what sort of progressive potentials that has on Palestine and even other issues?
Well, as you speak, Tony, I think of this wonderful team I support as well in Scotland, and that's Celtic. And have you seen the Palestinian banners that carried by the Celtic fans, and how Celtic have been fined because their fans carry that poster? And I'm not aware that the Celtic club have come down heavily on their fans to forbid this or to threaten them in any way. And Celtic have been that kind of club linked to republicanism, linked to Ireland. And, you know, the big battle royale in Scotland has been when the Blues, the Rangers, play Celtic. We have seen in that context, and especially the loyalty of the Celtic supporters and the way they support the Palestinian people, the voice of the fans and the strength. And that strength is seen around the world as well. I'm thinking of Latin America, and I'm thinking of the great Socrates, my favorite football player, my favorite sports person, actually, who played for Corinthians Democratica. They actually have Democrats, Corinthian Democrats, and he infused with the fans such spirit into that club. The club from top to bottom actually was highly democratic. The players were democratic. The fan base was that way inclined. And they stood up. I can't remember the exact year. I think it's probably about 1980.
I think it's like 81 or 82. 81,
82, where they stand up against the junta. And the junta has been forced to go to a referendum. And they thought that they could muscle it and needed it for some form of legitimacy. And Corinthians, and actually in the persona, but he always ensured the collective agency from the fans to the players to the entire club, the cleaners, the coach system, everybody, the security system, that vote yes for the constitutional change. And this they carried in their posters in the ground. They demonstrated it. He actually threatened, because an Italian club, I think it was Juventus, were in the process of signing him on. And he had said to the public of the whole of Brazil, I will sign on if the junta win, if we lose this vote. And you know, of course, the vote was won, and it was the end of the junta. But that exemplifies it. The Palestinians, in their spirit, are so strong in the community sense, as now is the Afghanistani women's team, Palestinian women's team as well. So it's the educational, the political, the social aspect of football that we talk about. BDS has tried, as we do in South Africa, we're part of a BDS movement which calls on UEFA to ban Israel. What's Israel doing in European football anyway? It's bizarre, and there's obviously a reason for it, because they know up till recently, of course, that they would have had a lot of problems with Israel playing in the Middle East. I don't know about now, but certainly fan bases from Algeria to Egypt to Morocco, Tunisia are so strong, despite this whole this whole approach to the Trump and the Biden approach of bringing Israel on board and bribing the Arab states. If Israel were to appear in a public event, sporting event, say, football event, in any of those countries, from Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan, right through the Maghreb, the Arab street speaks very loudly and passionately about the beautiful game. And, you know, it's on this basis that we've got to pressurize the international football body, FIFA, that Israel, as with apartheid South Africa, must be banned out of the Olympics, out of all sporting competitions that are team-based.
I have a quick question, which is just to slightly change subject. You've mentioned your love of Socrates, which, by the way, it just happens when you said that before in the messages before the program. I was like, what the hell? That happens to be, as Tony can tell you, that's my favorite player of all time.
Mine too,
I
yeah.
use him as my email, avatar. If you see me on social media, that's my photograph. But you also mentioned Eric Cantona, and before the program, you had mentioned to us that one of your favorite players is obviously Thierry Henry. And I want you to say a little bit about why is that so. But just to go back to what you said earlier about Brendan Batson and David Rocastle, in a previous program, we talked about it was Henry appears on this documentary called All or Nothing Arsenal, which I don't know if you've seen that. It's currently, you can watch it on the internet. But in this program, he mentions that Arsenal was the first club in London, and he's the first big club. He described it as the club of the people. It was a club that represented England, it represented Britain in that it played black players. But beyond that, so those are two different things. One is just kind of how he fits into that story that you were telling. But just if you could say a little bit more about why is it that you say that you love Thierry Henry so much?
Why I love Thierry Henry.
Yeah.
Wow. What a masterful football player. He wasn't in the greatest of Arsenal teams, but he instilled such magic and his skill unsurpassed. I remember him playing at White Hart Lane, and he was being jeered, and as usual, Arsenal jeered, and the Spurs take a corner, and he gets the ball in his own goal mouth, and he dribbles and runs like lightning, and then dribbles around numerous players and scores a goal, which was so brilliant, and then runs back the whole length of the pitch to where the Tottenham supporters are all filled behind the Arsenal goal, and he goes down and salutes them. My one son, who's a trade unionist, born in Britain and a trade unionist there, has framed that photograph for me. It's not in this room, unfortunately. I should have brought it out. It was, first of all, not only that absolute incredible skill, which epitomizes football. It's that poetry of the game. But it was his link with the fans. And it was his link with society as such and the world. I can't compare him in statements he might have made with the great Brazilian that I've referred to, Socrates and others. But you felt this about Thierry Henry, that he had that humanism about him, which Eric Cantona does as well and is very articulate. But, it was just the way he could spark the crowd, the incredible dignity of the man. He never gloated. He never lost temper. Eric Cantona famously did when he mule kicked one of the fans who was goading him or apparently spitting at him. But my best memories, and there are many, of my elation with Arsenal centers around Thierry Henry. So it's the way a figure becomes iconic and gets into your skull, but into your heart and spirit. And, just a very basic thing, his style. I loved the way he used to pull his socks up, his stockings, right over his knee and above his knee. And you see quite a few stylish players copying it these days. He came across as a very kindly, soft person as well. And I don't remember him ever fouling anybody or getting into any ugly altercations at all.
I mean, the Irish may disagree, but that he wasn't playing for Arsenal. Remember when he kind of used his hand to score a goal and he knocked Ireland out of the playoffs for the 2010 World Cup? Remember that? He played for France.
Please don't remind me of that. Yeah, I know. I guess that most players actually succumb at some stage in the spontaneous situation to losing the lob, as happened with Eric Cantona. But Cantona, again, for me, he comes close to Socrates as the passion of that guy. Of course, Arsenal have got somebody, a Brazilian now, like Socrates, who's changing the whole atmosphere. There's the most wonderful chant about him that I've just received from one of my sons who sent it. And it goes, they say he walks on water and turns it into wine. I believe in Jesus, the Arsenal number 9. I don't know if you've heard that. Have you come across it?
Not yet.
I'll email it to you, and it's done in that boisterous way. Oh, yeah. I believe in Arsenal.
It's actually repurposing a chant from the Irish days. I can't remember, the words were different, but because, as you said, Arsenal was an Irish club. Being Irish in London in the mid-70s, when the nationalists had started a bombing campaign on the English mainland, was not fun. It was like you were a very embattled group of people. And Arsenal was a bit of a refuge.
Absolutely. But I've been to Arsenal, Ireland. I was there for a month during June, doing various talks and book launches. The only country in the world that I know and have experienced where you sell more of your books than people who are present. And I'm talking about 150 people at a book launch event, and you'll top that number, Tony, every single time in Ireland. But the Irish and the Republicans are essentially into other games like Gaelic football and hurling and so on, and I've got a little bit into that. Of course, Georgie Best is the best and most well-known and well-loved Irishman, who I'd also seen back in the day when I was in England. And I mean, he was the most masterful player. But there's a story which I've read about Georgie Best and Johansson, the South African that Aesop admired so much, who sadly became an alcoholic and died in absolute poverty. And it's Georgie Best who talks about sitting in a restaurant, and I think it's in Leeds or somewhere, and he sees this guy shuffling past with his head bowed, and it suddenly strikes him that it's Johansson, Albert Johansson. Georgie Best obviously didn't take that as a lesson, because we know what happened to him as a result of his boozing. But, anyway, I had wanted to talk about the young communists affiliated and supporting Arsenal. And there's an Irishman, Sean Hosey, who actually supported Coventry, where he lived or where he came from. Born in Ireland, the family moved to Coventry, working class Republicans and actually communists. And Sean grows up in Coventry, but works in London, and with the YCL influence, supports Arsenal. So we used to meet up at the North End. The other side of the ground, popular side, was called the Clock End. Clock End, give us a wave, give us a wave, we used to chant. And he was one of my first recruits coming in and out of South Africa. together with a friend of his called Steve Marsling, a Arsenal supporter. Also, that was his second team. But they go out to South Africa and they carry out distributions, etc., make a big impact with others who are there. I actually used to send out not just YCLers, but Trotskyist comrades who I'd recruited out of the universities, incidentally. So I wasn't such a bad Stalinist, they told me. I could bring the communists and the Trotskyists together. We still have reunions when I go to London with these guys. But Sean then is sent on a second run into South Africa on his own, just to meet an underground comrade and to pass him false IDs, passes, the ID books that Africans, as we know, were forced to carry on pain of arrest and imprisonment if they didn't, and money. And we meeting at the Arsenal, and after the game, I'm giving him money for the ticket and the documents, etc., that he's going to take in. Steve was meant to go, but couldn't for some reason. But Sean was available. It was just a one-man task. And we arranged between the three of us to meet back at the Arsenal ground when they were playing Coventry. And it was 2 home games in successively. So I meet up with Steve Marsling, North End, where we usually stand and watch the game with Sean. And we're there a good half an hour before the game, drinking our beers in those days and singing and chanting. And Sean's not there. And we're thinking, where the flipping hell is he? He's usually here well before the start of the game. Game starts, he's not there. We get to half time, no sign of Sean. We start really worrying, feeling actually so sick. Even though Arsenal defeat Coventry, I wasn't even paying attention. The end of the game, the guy's not there, hoping that maybe he missed the plane or the plane was delayed. So Steve says to me, he'll go back to Sean's digs. He's staying in a typical Irish boarding house. And we arranged to meet a bit later that evening in the area. So I go off to a pub and I'm drinking the Guinness away and so on. And he comes back white-faced after several hours. And, I couldn't go to the place with him. That was out of bounds in terms of the security factor. So he goes there, comes back a couple of hours later, he's ashen-faced. And he tells me that it's a bit peculiar, the landlady had said to him, that Sean had said he'd be away for a few days, which usually could happen. But somebody had pitched up at the boarding house and had said he was there for Sean, and he might have even had a note. I'm not sure. But he needed to get something from Sean's room, and he had the key. I think that was the point. So he was let in. And in the room, the landlady wasn't watching. Guy spent 10 minutes there and then left. So we immediately realized, that something really bad has taken place. And very soon we actually learned, because the South Africans had to inform the British High Commission that they had arrested a Brit. And this was the arrest. This is the reason why he hadn't reappeared to meet us as arranged. As it turned out, the comrade who he was meant to meet had broken down. The security police in South Africa had got information, had sent a black security officer dressed up in a simple jacket and slacks and so on to meet him at a particular rendezvous point, exchanged the the passwords, the recognition words with each other. He had handed over the money and the documents, and then suddenly was surrounded by white policemen pointing guns. He ended up serving a 5-year sentence. He was very brutally beaten and tortured and so on before. He was a hero when he came back from South Africa, and we're great friends still to this day with him. Forever a Coventry supporter, down below in other leagues, and I'm the Arsenal supporter. But that was one very, very sad outcome of meeting in a ground which I can't say it was always a ground of joy. We had many defeats there as well. But that's an aside about.
Ronnie, is this in that book? Is this in the book and the film London Recruits?
Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning it. So the London Recruits, a film is being made of it, reconstruction, part documentary, part enactment. I haven't seen the final product. It's in the process of finalization now. And Sean is, this episode there is a key element, including some clips from the Arsenal ground.
There you go.
Because it was made now and Highbury no longer exists, the closest place they could go to for the reshoot of the sequence with young actors playing me, Steve Marsling, and Sean was at club, one of the lesser clubs, second division clubs in London. Sorry, the name just eludes me. You'll have to watch the movie. But what they've slunk into it is the sequence which didn't take place at Highbury, but of Charlie George scoring the wonderful final goal and ending up on his back. You know, again, what an iconic image for the fact of a working class young footballer, which Charlie George epitomized, that East End London spirit, or Islington spirit, actually. He was from the neighborhood. But that typical working class London spirit of throwing himself back. And he did it twice in that game. He did it after scoring the goal, and he did it on full time. He repeated it. And I've just been reading something about this in the Arsene Wenger book, it might have been, or somewhere else. He was asked about why he flopped the same way and threw himself on his back. He said he was just utterly exhausted at the end of that game. I've seen him at Arsenal and said hello to him, although he wouldn't know who the hell I am. But I've been back there quite a few times, and sometimes as a guest.
That's nice.
And in relation to that,
did you, just before you continue, did you, when you would go as a guest, did you go, was that when the son of Costa Ghazi was?
No, not at all. Not when Costa Ghazi's son was there. His name was Gazidis. His name was Gazidis, Greek guy. Costa Gazidis. He changed his name to Ghazi, which, you know, and you see, Toza means blood. And he was a doctor who joined the PAC after being with me in the Congress of Democrats in the old days, back in the 60s. His son made it very well in London and became the CEO.
Right.
And I think I had tried my luck with Costa, but you know, I actually don't like doing things like that because it's quite a burden, and there are obviously so many people who ask one, and he never responded to me. It was an email. He's living in Cape Town. But when I was a minister for my sins, it was very easy to get invited. They knew that I loved Arsenal and so on, and I was invited quite a number of times. And it was on those times that I would meet the odd player. And I'd met Charlie George, very simple, very working class guy who takes fans or tourists on a walkabout in the stadium and see the Arsenal Museum and so on. But I'll never forget, look at my hair these days. They're these long hair right down to his shoulders, and a very pugnacious look on his face, almost sneering, but a bit deadpan. Never smiled. You never saw him smile, actually. He was a great player. So, look, here we are. We're talking about these images in life. I'm 84 now. My body's giving in. It's stiff from all the wrong things that I've done to my body in my life, including playing football as a young kid, and I was pretty good, if I may say so myself, at school. But look at the joy that one gets out of this. And you can never, if you support a team's got its ups and downs. A team can be utterly in the doldrums and inconsequential. You get utterly depressed and you stick to it. And then the joy arrives. So now we've got this brand new team with the most lovely, exciting players. And I'm so happy.
I think there's just one note in there that it's not only for the joy. Like, this is actually, I've seen, a lot of British sports, lefty theorists, I have to explain this to Americans who don't get it, is that it's not just the joy, because any of us supporting a team knows. I mean, I've supported Liverpool since 74. We had episodes of absolute dominance, and we had episodes completely in the wilderness. But basically, both are important. The one is you sharing your joy, but also the solidarity of collective suffering. That's like what the church was. The church was for working class people, and then football replaced it as like, yes, we're going to share our suffering, and once every 25 years we'll win something. Like,
absolutely. But they're teams that never win anything, and they've got the most incredible fan base.
Yeah.
And these are the teams with a real community spirit. Fantastic, absolutely outstanding.
They're waiting for their best.
It's just, it's something. Look, I like many sports, and I've played a lot of sports. A lot of South Africans have, and privileged whites. So I could swim and run, and cricket and rugby, and as well as the working class game, which is football for sure. But in terms of that, all these teams, and I absolutely love their support base because they never get anywhere, and the fans stick to them. So I mentioned I've got two sons. They've both been pretty political. They were both born in London. So the trade union guy who's in the RMT, Railway Maritime Transport Union, who started the whole strike action, both of them were crazy about Arsenal. The older one, Andrew, is back in South Africa. Chris is the RMT guy. He doesn't support Arsenal anymore. Once it went to the Emirates, and once football started becoming so commodified and commercialized, what he does is he goes to the local football, which happens to be in Hendon, London. And he goes around and watches their away games, and not all of them. It's not every game, but I've been with him to some of those games, and I've enjoyed it almost, in a sense, as much as a day at a big game as well. I mean, you can have 500 to 2,000. It's great when there's as many as about 2,000 to those games, because the atmosphere is brilliant and the humor is fantastic. I think this is a big thing about the English game, the humor of that game. And that's captured the working class humor in Britain. Have you guys heard about the definition of football? Now, I'm not talking about the old-fashioned one, about football and rugby. The one being the game for a working class game.
You mean played by gentlemen and watched by hooligans? That whole thing.
The gentlemen, that's the one, and the workers.
And hooligans.
No, the latest one is the difference. The how you can tell the difference in the definition aspect is that rugby is a game. where these 15 guys are always pretending that they haven't been injured. And football's the game where the 11 guys are always trying to pretend that they have been injured by the opposition.
Can I ask you a final question before you go, which is to bring it back to where you live now, which is South Africa.
Yeah.
And I understand you also have a personal stake in the future of South African sports. But how would you, do you have any comments about, South Africa is very good at rugby. It's arguably probably right now, I think it's one of the best teams in the world. But its football hasn't been doing so well. Neither, and the cricket is finally sort of showing up again, although the structure of the cricket game means that South Africans will be playing more T20 and not so many tests. Like, what do you think about what do you make of what's happened to South African sport after apartheid? I know there's a lot of emotional investment that people have in South African sport, but can you talk a little bit about just your feelings and perceptions about what's happening to South African sport?
Okay, sure. Thinking in terms of your time and my time as well, because we could have so much discussion on this. And this is where I become rather dejected and depressed, because apart from some of the high points, like winning the Rugby World Cup twice, and doing so with Mandela famously in 95, and some at the rugby level, some really wonderful examples. And I want to come to a family example, which is making us really ecstatic at the moment. But the biggest sadness and sorrow for me is how South African football has declined. And when everything opened up after 1990 and the move to democracy, we had a lovely team, black and white, playing together. And we thought that we were going to really achieve great heights. But the administration and the corruption, maladministration in South African football, I think, has really dented the game so badly. There are some wonderful teams, and my team are the Bones Pirates. I've always supported. Why
do we support the same things? I support Pirates too.
And they, after just a few games, at the moment they top of the league by 1 point over Sundowns. But the game itself has been spoilt here. There's the globalized factor of what the wealthy countries, again, the imperialist countries, the apartheid aspect in the world, have done to countries in Africa, for instance, particularly, where the best players are exported and do so well abroad. So football's in the doldrums here, and I'm personally ashamed that I'm not really following it anymore. And that's because, in a sense, I've been seduced by the globalization of this game, and I try to fight against it. This is where I start philosophizing, and I don't want to. But the rugby aspect is somewhat better. We've had some marvelous black players emerging, but at the same time, it's also the administrative aspect. And in cricket as well, let me tell you this. A guy comes to fix my television set a couple of weeks ago, and there was a cricket match on. There was something that had to be altered with the set. And he's a mixed race guy in his late 50s, probably about mid-50s, gap tooth missing here, lovely humor, and we're getting on really well. And I said, "Do you like cricket?" And he says, "Boy, do I like cricket." He says to me, "I play cricket, and I play for the 50-year-old. We got a team, South African team." And he unburdened himself, and in the discussion, he wasn't bragging. I discovered he was one of these guys who missed out in life because of apartheid, because of racism, that it seemed, and I've inquired from others, that he would have got into a South African cricket team. that was non-race. I think he was actually into his 60s. He then started telling me, I asked him about the game today and some of the white guys who play and who coach, who we've seen playing in the 90s and into this millennia, etc. And from him, I learned how there's this racism there, how they disparage the players of color, most of them, and an exceptional few. Van Diesen, who I'm now calling Van Decent, you know.
Yeah. I know you're talking about. Rassie Van.
He said to me, I want to tell you that man is a saint. He's a guy who doesn't know color, who treats us and treats the black guys, and he mentions all the names of the black guys who've emerged. He says most of these guys who we've seen from the 90s right through, including a lot who are still playing, are really not genuine. And that game, the choice, if you get a white guy, and there are a few who are failing miserably, and you'll see how they selected again and again. If you've had a colored black guy, I'm looking colored in that sense, they're not given that much trial. You know, it's still there. It's deep within. I want to end on a really happy note, because we've got a family godson. My son here in London's actually the godfather. Andrew is the godfather of the up-and-coming rugby fly half, whose name happens to be Sacha Feinberg, Jewish father, and Nngomezulu, African mother. There he is. Sacha, my beauty. Oh, there you are, Sacha. Great. That guy is now the captain fly half of South African Springboks Under-20. And he plays for one of the best rugby teams in our Premier League, and which plays internationally, and that's your Cape Town-based crowd, Tony, the Stormers. And because his mother had some funds, they didn't get married, which is why Nngomezulu is the main name. But the father has brought him up, Nick Feinberg, who was a mad Chelsea supporter in London, and then followed his father and the likes of me back home as a young kid in the 90s. And Sacha played football in primary school, and Ajax Cape Town wanted to sign him on. But because the mother had some good cash, he went to Bishops. And they said to Nick Feinberg, your son is the most wonderful prospect here. Please allow him to play rugby. Nick had to change mindset from football. He knew nothing about rugby. He watches every game now. And Sacha is beautiful to behold. Wonderful story. This is the new South Africa. And if in terms of our sports, from the football game, at least there you've got really representative, but it's basically the black game, working class and so on. Rugby, cricket and the other upcoming games, basketball and the like. This would transform South African sport. We would become a real superpower, as we've seen at times with the Proteas cricket guys at times really shone, and of course the rugby team. So it's a question like the politics, and I'd like to end on this note. In terms of the politics in South Africa, it affects all life. It affects social life. Unless you might have a Tory government in London, but in England, sorry, or you had the junta in Brazil. But if you've had a sporting community that's developed, that's had the oxygen to do so, and has become part of the whole social fabric of society, it survives any kind of government. In countries which are not quite developed in that sense, and where there's been a break in the social condition, like South Africa, out of the schools, which is vital to sport. And if it's not organized, and our education system is in a hell of a state. So I'm saying that for sporting prowess to really flourish in a mass-based way, not in an elitist way out of the universities, which you do see happening in certain sports, fencing and equestrian sports, obviously. Rugby at certain times and places has been the case. But were we to resolve the socio-economic contradictions within South Africa, I believe we would see a real South African spring in the sporting world. That's as far as I'm going to go in terms of my discussion with Joe Slovo and philosophy and sport, particularly football. But Arsenal at the moment are on top of the league, and we've got a man in the number 9 shirt whose name is Jesus, but a lot of other outstanding players. Thanks, guys. I've enjoyed the chat.
Ronnie, this was a pleasure and an absolute privilege for us and for our audience. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can camp you back here sometime.
Okay, for sure, any time and whatever subject. But if I can say, could we dedicate this program to my greatest sportsman of all time, Socrates?
That's a lovely way to end this. I love that. I love that one. Thank you very much, Ronnie.
And the Palestinians, to be sure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.